New Orleans feels like a place where time moves differently, where the past and present dance together in the humid air. Tonight, we'll discover how a swampy outpost at the mouth of the Mississippi River became one of America's most captivating cities, a place where French aristocrats, Spanish colonists, enslaved Africans, free people of color, and countless immigrants created something entirely new. This is the story of how cultures didn't just meet in New Orleans. They collided, merged, and gave birth to jazz, Creole cuisine, and a way of life unlike anywhere else on Earth. We'll start with the indigenous peoples who first called this land home. And from there, we'll follow the incredible journey of how a strategic trading post evolved into the birthplace of America's greatest musical export. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the vibrant history of the Crescent City. When you think of New Orleans today, perhaps you picture the wrought iron balconies of the French Quarter, the sound of jazz spilling from dimly lit clubs, or the colourful spectacle of Mardi Gras. But long before any of these existed, this land belonged to a very different world. The area we now call New Orleans was home to several indigenous groups for thousands of years before European explorers ever set foot on North American soil. The Chitimacha, Choctaw, and other tribes had established thriving communities throughout the Mississippi River Delta. They understood something that would take European colonists decades to grasp. This was a land of constant change, where the mighty Mississippi regularly shifted its course, depositing rich sediment and creating new land even as it washed other areas away. These indigenous peoples had learned to live with the river's moods, building their settlements on higher ground and developing sophisticated methods for navigating the complex network of waterways that crisscrossed the region. The landscape itself was unlike anything most Europeans had ever encountered. Vast cypress swamps stretched as far as the eye could see, their ancient trees draped in Spanish moss like ghostly curtains. Alligators glided silently through dark waters, while countless species of birds filled the air with their calls. This was a primordial world, both beautiful and dangerous, where survival required intimate knowledge of the land's rhythms and secrets. But everything began to change in the late 17th century when French explorers started making their way down the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes region. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, had claimed the entire Mississippi River Valley for France in 1682, naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. However, claiming territory and actually controlling it were two very different things, as the French would soon discover. The strategic importance of the Mississippi River mouth was obvious to anyone who understood trade and military tactics. Whoever controlled this vital waterway could potentially control commerce throughout the vast interior of North America. The Mississippi was like a liquid highway, carrying goods and people from the heart of the continent to the Gulf of Mexico and beyond to Europe, the Caribbean, and the wider world. In 1718, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, a French naval officer and colonial administrator, made a decision that would change history. He established a settlement on a crescent-shaped bend of the Mississippi River, about 100 miles upriver from the Gulf of Mexico. The location was far from ideal in many ways. The site was swampy, prone to flooding, and plagued by mosquitoes that carried yellow fever and other diseases. But Bienville understood that sometimes geography trumps comfort, and this particular bend in the river offered something invaluable: control. Bienville named his new settlement La Nouvelle-Orléans, or New Orleans, in honor of Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, who served as regent of France at the time. The city was laid out in a grid pattern that still exists today in what we now call the French Quarter, or Vieux Carré. The original settlement was tiny, just a few blocks surrounded by a wooden palisade for protection, but it represented something much larger: France's ambition to dominate North American trade. From the very beginning, New Orleans was a multicultural experiment, though not always a voluntary one. The French colonists who arrived in those early years brought with them enslaved Africans to work the plantations and build the city. These Africans came from various regions of West and Central Africa, each bringing their own languages, religions, and cultural traditions. The forced migration of enslaved peoples would become one of the most tragic and defining aspects of New Orleans history, but it would also contribute to the city's unique cultural identity in ways that continue to resonate today. The early years of French New Orleans were marked by struggle and uncertainty. The climate was brutal for Europeans unaccustomed to subtropical heat and humidity. Yellow fever epidemics swept through the population regularly, earning New Orleans a reputation as one of the most dangerous places in the Americas for white settlers. The city's location, while strategically valuable, also made it vulnerable to hurricanes, floods, and the constant threat of the Mississippi changing its course. Yet despite these challenges, the settlement slowly began to grow. French colonists, many of whom were younger sons of noble families seeking their fortune in the New World, established plantations along the river. They grew indigo, rice, and later sugarcane, crops that required intensive labor and contributed to the expansion of slavery in the region. The wealth generated by these plantations would become the foundation of New Orleans' economy for generations to come. But perhaps even more important than agriculture was trade. New Orleans quickly became a hub for commerce throughout the Mississippi River Valley. Fur traders, merchants, and adventurers from across the frontier converged on the city to buy, sell, and exchange goods. Native American tribes brought furs and hides to trade for European manufactured goods. Rivermen floated flatboats down from as far away as Pennsylvania and Ohio, carrying grain, whiskey, and other products to market. This constant flow of people and goods made New Orleans unlike any other city in colonial America. While other settlements were often dominated by a single ethnic or cultural group, New Orleans was cosmopolitan from its earliest days. French colonists mingled with Spanish traders, free people of color conducted business alongside enslaved workers, and Native Americans maintained their own distinct presence in and around the city. The French also established what would become known as the Code Noir, or Black Code, a set of laws governing the treatment of enslaved people and free people of color. While these laws were designed to maintain white supremacy and control, they also inadvertently created more space for cultural mixing than existed in other parts of colonial America. Enslaved people were allowed to gather on Sundays in what is now Congo Square, where they could play music, dance, and maintain connections to their African heritage. These gatherings would later prove crucial to the development of jazz and other uniquely New Orleans musical traditions. The city's unique geography also contributed to its distinctive culture. Built below sea level and surrounded by water, New Orleans developed its own methods for dealing with everything from flooding to burial of the dead. The famous above-ground cemeteries, with their elaborate tombs and mausoleums, became necessary because bodies buried in the soggy ground would often float to the surface during floods. Even death took on a different character in New Orleans. French colonial architecture began to take shape during this period, though most of the buildings from the earliest years have not survived. The colonists adapted European building techniques to the local climate, creating structures with high ceilings, large windows, and wide galleries designed to catch breezes and provide shade from the intense sun. These architectural innovations would later influence the distinctive Creole cottages and townhouses that still grace New Orleans neighborhoods today. Religion played a complex role in early New Orleans society. While the city was officially Catholic, reflecting its French origins, the reality was much more complicated. Enslaved Africans brought their own spiritual traditions, which often blended with Catholicism in syncretic practices that would eventually evolve into voodoo and other distinctive religious expressions. Native Americans maintained their own spiritual beliefs, and as the city grew, other religious traditions would find their way into the mix. The food culture of New Orleans also began to take shape during the French colonial period. French cooking techniques combined with local ingredients like seafood from the Gulf of Mexico, rice from the surrounding wetlands, and vegetables that could thrive in the subtropical climate. Enslaved cooks, drawing on their knowledge of African ingredients and cooking methods, began creating the fusion cuisine that would eventually become famous worldwide as Creole cooking. Music was present from the very beginning of New Orleans history. French colonists brought their own musical traditions, while enslaved Africans maintained theirs despite the brutal conditions of bondage. Native Americans had their own rich musical heritage, and as these different traditions began to interact and influence each other, something entirely new began to emerge. The musical experimentation happening in early New Orleans would lay the groundwork for developments that wouldn't fully flower until more than a century later. By the 1760s, New Orleans had established itself as a significant colonial outpost, but major changes were on the horizon. The French and Indian War had exhausted France's resources and fundamentally altered the balance of power in North America. In a secret treaty signed in 1762, France ceded Louisiana, including New Orleans, to Spain. The news didn't reach the colonists until 1764, and when it did, it sparked the first of many political upheavals that would shape the city's future. The transition from French to Spanish rule would not be smooth, and it would set the stage for even more dramatic changes to come. But that's a story for the next part of our journey through New Orleans history, as we explore how Spanish colonial rule would bring new influences, new conflicts, and new opportunities to this remarkable city where cultures collide. The Spanish takeover of New Orleans in the 1760s marks the beginning of one of the most tumultuous periods in the city's early history. When news finally reached the colonists that their beloved French Louisiana had been secretly handed over to Spain, the reaction was swift and fierce. Many French settlers felt betrayed by their mother country, and they had little desire to live under Spanish rule. The cultural differences between French and Spanish colonial systems were significant, and the residents of New Orleans feared losing the freedoms and traditions they had established over nearly half a century. The Spanish, however, were in no hurry to take control. It wasn't until 1766 that the first Spanish governor, Antonio de Ulloa, arrived in New Orleans, and his reception was anything but warm. Ulloa was a scientist and explorer rather than a seasoned colonial administrator, and he quickly found himself overwhelmed by the challenges of governing a restive French population. The colonists resented Spanish trade restrictions, which threatened their profitable commerce with France and the French Caribbean islands. Tensions simmered for 2 years before finally boiling over in what became known as the Louisiana Rebellion of 1768. The rebellion was led by prominent French colonists who had grown wealthy under the previous system and had no intention of quietly accepting Spanish authority. They expelled Governor Ulloa from the city, effectively declaring independence from Spanish rule. For several months, New Orleans existed in a state of political limbo, governed by a revolutionary council that desperately hoped France might reclaim its former colony. But those hopes were quickly dashed when Spain sent a new governor with very different instructions. Alejandro O'Reilly arrived in New Orleans in August 1769 with more than 2,000 Spanish soldiers and a mandate to crush the rebellion once and for all. O'Reilly, an Irishman in Spanish service, had earned a reputation as an efficient and ruthless colonial administrator. He wasted no time in asserting Spanish authority, arresting the rebellion's leaders and putting them on trial for treason. 5 of the conspirators were executed by firing squad, while others were sentenced to prison terms. The message was clear: Spanish rule was not negotiable. Despite this harsh beginning, Spanish colonial rule would ultimately prove transformative for New Orleans in ways that few could have predicted. O'Reilly, who became known as Bloody O'Reilly for his suppression of the rebellion, actually proved to be an effective administrator who understood the importance of adapting Spanish law to local conditions. He allowed French colonists to maintain many of their customs and even permitted the continued use of French civil law in certain matters. More importantly, he recognized that New Orleans' prosperity depended on maintaining its role as a trading hub, and he gradually relaxed the restrictive trade policies that had sparked the original rebellion. Under Spanish rule, New Orleans experienced a period of remarkable growth and cultural flowering. The Spanish governors who followed O'Reilly were generally more flexible than their French predecessors had been, and they actively encouraged immigration to strengthen their hold on the territory. This open-door policy brought new waves of settlers from diverse backgrounds, each adding their own threads to the city's cultural tapestry. One of the most significant groups to arrive during the Spanish period were the Acadians, French-speaking Catholics, who had been expelled from Nova Scotia by the British during the French and Indian War. These refugees, who became known as Cajuns, initially settled in the rural areas surrounding New Orleans, but their influence on the city's culture was profound. They brought with them their own musical traditions, cooking techniques, and ways of life that would blend seamlessly with the existing French Creole culture. The Spanish period also saw the arrival of increasing numbers of free people of color, both from the Caribbean and from within Louisiana itself. Spanish law was generally more liberal than French law when it came to manumission, the freeing of enslaved people, and this created opportunities for enslaved individuals to purchase their own freedom or that of their family members. The growing free-colored population became an important middle class in New Orleans society, working as artisans, shopkeepers, and skilled laborers. Many became quite prosperous and formed their own distinct cultural identity, separate from both the white Creole elite and the enslaved population. Spanish colonial architecture began to transform the physical appearance of New Orleans during this period. While the basic French colonial grid pattern remained unchanged, new buildings reflected Spanish influences in their design and construction. The Spanish introduced new building techniques, including the use of brick between posts construction and different approaches to gallery design. Many of the buildings that tourists admire today in the French Quarter were actually built during the Spanish colonial period, though they incorporated elements from both French and Spanish architectural traditions. Two devastating fires during the Spanish period would fundamentally reshape the physical landscape of New Orleans. The first Great Fire struck on Good Friday in 1788, destroying more than 850 buildings and leaving much of the city in ruins. The fire started in a candle shop on Chartres Street and spread rapidly through the predominantly wooden structures that made up most of the city at that time. Strong winds fed the flames, and the city's volunteer fire department proved inadequate to contain the blaze. By the time it was finally extinguished, most of the original French colonial city had been reduced to ashes. The rebuilding that followed the 1788 fire created much of the architectural character that visitors associate with the French Quarter today. Spanish building codes required the use of more brick and tile, making structures more fire-resistant, but also giving them a distinctly different appearance from their French predecessors. The new buildings featured the famous wrought iron balconies, thick brick walls, and red tile roofs that became synonymous with New Orleans architecture. Ironically, what many people think of as French colonial architecture is actually Spanish colonial architecture built on French colonial foundations. But the city's troubles weren't over. Just 6 years later, in 1794, another major fire swept through New Orleans, destroying more than 200 additional buildings. This second fire, while not as devastating as the first, reinforced the need for better fire prevention and building standards. The Spanish colonial government responded by implementing even stricter building codes and establishing a more professional fire department. These measures helped protect the city from future conflagrations, but they also contributed to the distinctive architectural character that makes New Orleans unique among American cities. During the Spanish period, New Orleans also became a crucial center for the slave trade in North America. The city's location made it an ideal port for ships carrying enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean, and Spanish policies generally favored the expansion of plantation agriculture. The wealth generated by slave labor funded much of the city's growth during this period, creating the economic foundation that would support New Orleans' cultural development for generations to come. At the same time, the relatively liberal Spanish policies toward manumission created opportunities for some enslaved people to gain their freedom, contributing to the growth of the free-colored population. The mixing of cultures that had begun under French rule accelerated dramatically during the Spanish period. Spanish colonists brought their own traditions, languages, and customs, but they also proved more willing than the French to intermarry with other groups. The result was an increasingly complex society where racial and cultural categories became fluid in ways that were unusual for colonial America. People of mixed African, European, and Native American ancestry formed distinct communities with their own identities and cultural practices. Music continued to evolve during the Spanish colonial period as new influences merged with existing traditions. Spanish musical forms mixed with French, African, and Native American styles, creating new hybrid expressions that existed nowhere else in the world. The regular Sunday gatherings in Congo Square continued under Spanish rule, providing a space where enslaved and free people of color could maintain and develop their cultural traditions. These musical gatherings were becoming increasingly sophisticated, incorporating elements from multiple African musical traditions, as well as European harmonic structures. The food culture of New Orleans also continued to develop during the Spanish period, as new ingredients and cooking techniques were introduced. Spanish colonists brought their own culinary traditions, including the use of different spices and cooking methods. The combination of Spanish, French, African, and Native American influences was creating a distinctive cuisine that would eventually become world famous. Rice became even more important during this period, and the development of what would later be called jambalaya and other signature dishes can be traced to Spanish colonial innovations. Religion remained complex during the Spanish period, though Catholicism became more firmly established as the official faith. The Spanish were generally more zealous Catholics than the French had been, and they made greater efforts to convert enslaved Africans and Native Americans to Christianity. However, the syncretic religious practices that had developed under French rule continued to evolve, often incorporating Spanish Catholic elements alongside French and African traditions. These religious innovations would later contribute to the development of distinctive New Orleans spiritual practices. Trade continued to be the lifeblood of New Orleans throughout the Spanish period, and the city's commercial importance only grew with time. Spanish policies eventually became quite liberal regarding trade with other nations, allowing New Orleans merchants to do business not only with Spain and its colonies, but also with France, Britain, and even the newly independent United States. This commercial openness attracted merchants and traders from around the world, further contributing to the city's cosmopolitan character. By the end of the Spanish colonial period, New Orleans had been transformed from a struggling French outpost into a thriving, multicultural city. The population had grown dramatically, the economy had diversified, and the unique cultural synthesis that would make New Orleans famous was beginning to take recognizable shape. But even greater changes were on the horizon, as political developments in Europe and North America would soon bring New Orleans under yet another flag, setting the stage for its emergence as one of America's most distinctive and influential cities. The turn of the 19th century brought unprecedented upheaval to New Orleans, as the forces of revolution and empire collided across the Atlantic world. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power in France, and his ambitions would soon reshape the destiny of the Crescent City in ways no one could have anticipated. The Spanish colonial period, which had brought stability and growth to New Orleans, was about to come to an abrupt end through a series of secret negotiations that would once again leave the city's residents wondering about their future. In 1800, Napoleon forced Spain to return Louisiana to France through the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso. The news didn't reach New Orleans immediately, but when it did, it sent shockwaves through the community. After more than 3 decades under Spanish rule, the prospect of returning to French control stirred complex emotions among the city's diverse population. Some French Creoles welcomed the possibility of reunification with their cultural homeland, while others had grown comfortable under the relatively liberal Spanish system and feared change. But Napoleon's interest in Louisiana was primarily strategic rather than sentimental. He envisioned using New Orleans and the vast Louisiana territory as a base for rebuilding France's North American empire, which had been shattered by defeats in the 7 Years' War. His plans included using the territory to support French sugar colonies in the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, which was generating enormous wealth for the French treasury. However, these grand imperial schemes would soon collide with the reality of events unfolding in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines, had been raging since 1791, and it would prove to be the decisive factor in determining New Orleans' future. Napoleon had dispatched a massive military expedition to Haiti in 1802, intending to crush the rebellion and restore French control over the colony's lucrative sugar plantations. The failure of this expedition, combined with the enormous costs in money and lives, fundamentally altered Napoleon's calculations about the value of maintaining a North American empire. Meanwhile, the United States was growing increasingly concerned about French control of New Orleans. American farmers and merchants in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys depended on the port of New Orleans to ship their goods to market, and the prospect of a powerful European nation controlling this vital outlet was deeply troubling to American leaders. President Thomas Jefferson famously wrote that the day France took control of New Orleans would be the moment when America would have to seek an alliance with Britain, France's greatest enemy. American concerns intensified in 1802 when Spanish officials in New Orleans, acting on orders from Madrid but anticipating the transfer to France, revoked the right of deposit that allowed American merchants to store goods in New Orleans warehouses duty-free while awaiting shipment. This action effectively closed the Mississippi River to American commerce and sparked outrage throughout the American frontier. War fever began to spread, and many Americans called for military action to seize New Orleans by force. Jefferson, however, preferred diplomacy to war and dispatched Robert Livingston as minister to France with instructions to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and West Florida. The president was willing to pay up to $10 million for these territories, a sum that represented a significant portion of the federal budget at the time. But when Livingston arrived in Paris, he found Napoleon's government uninterested in selling any part of Louisiana and unwilling even to acknowledge that the territory had been transferred from Spain to France. The situation changed dramatically in early 1803 when news reached Paris of the final collapse of French forces in Haiti. Yellow fever had decimated Napoleon's army, and the successful slave rebellion had cost France not only its most valuable colony, but also tens of thousands of soldiers and millions of francs. Faced with this disaster and the looming prospect of renewed war with Britain, Napoleon began to reconsider his North American ambitions. The emperor realized that he lacked the naval power to defend Louisiana against British or American attack, and maintaining the territory would require resources he could not spare from his European campaigns. More importantly, he needed money immediately to fund his planned invasion of Britain. In one of history's most consequential decisions, Napoleon decided to abandon his North American empire entirely and sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. When Napoleon's foreign minister, Talleyrand, approached Livingston with an offer to sell not just New Orleans but all of Louisiana, the American diplomat was stunned. The territory encompassed more than 800,000 square miles, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border and from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The asking price was $15 million, and Napoleon wanted an immediate answer. Livingston was soon joined by James Monroe, who had been dispatched by Jefferson with additional negotiating authority. The two Americans found themselves in the remarkable position of being offered far more territory than they had been authorized to purchase, at a price that exceeded their instructions by only $5 million. They knew that communications with Washington would take months, and Napoleon was making it clear that the offer would not remain on the table indefinitely. On April 30th, 1803, Livingston and Monroe signed the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, doubling the size of the United States at a cost of approximately 3 cents per acre. The transaction was completed so quickly that the exact boundaries of the territory remained unclear, leading to years of diplomatic disputes with Spain and Britain. But for New Orleans, the implications were immediately apparent. After 85 years under French and Spanish rule, the city would become part of the American Republic. The news of the Louisiana Purchase reached New Orleans in the late summer of 1803, creating a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and uncertainty among the city's residents. Many French Creoles worried about their future under American rule, fearing that their Catholic religion, French language, and distinctive legal system would be swept away by Protestant Anglo-American culture. Spanish colonists faced similar concerns, while free people of color wondered whether American racial laws would be more restrictive than the relatively liberal Spanish system they had known. The formal transfer of Louisiana from France to the United States took place in New Orleans on December 20th, 1803, in a ceremony at the Cabildo, the Spanish colonial government building that still stands in Jackson Square today. The event was remarkably brief, lasting only about 20 minutes, but it marked one of the most significant moments in American history. William C. Claiborne, the American territorial governor, received the keys to the city from Pierre Clément de Losas, the French colonial prefect who had governed Louisiana for barely 3 weeks. The transition to American rule was not without its challenges. The residents of New Orleans spoke primarily French and Spanish, practiced Roman Catholicism, and lived under a legal system based on continental European rather than English common law traditions. American officials struggled to communicate with local residents and understand the complex social hierarchies that had developed under colonial rule. The cultural gap between Anglo-American settlers and French Creole society would remain a source of tension for decades to come. One of the most significant changes under American rule was the rapid influx of English-speaking settlers from other parts of the United States. These newcomers, often called Americans by the existing French and Spanish residents, brought with them different business practices, religious beliefs, and social customs. They tended to settle in areas outside the original city, particularly upriver from Canal Street in what became known as the American sector, creating a physical and cultural divide that persisted well into the 20th century. The economic implications of American rule were enormous for New Orleans. The city's strategic importance as the gateway to the Mississippi River Valley made it crucial to the expanding American economy, and trade volumes increased dramatically in the years following the Louisiana Purchase. Cotton became increasingly important as plantations spread throughout the Mississippi River Valley, and New Orleans emerged as the primary port for shipping this valuable crop to textile mills in New England and Europe. The expansion of cotton cultivation had profound implications for slavery in Louisiana. the demand for enslaved labor grew dramatically as new plantations were established throughout the territory, and New Orleans became one of the largest slave markets in North America. The city's slave markets, located near the French Quarter, became notorious for their size and the brutal efficiency with which human beings were bought and sold like any other commodity. At the same time, New Orleans maintained its distinctive three-tier racial system, which included whites, free people of color, and enslaved people. This system was more complex than the binary black-white racial categories that prevailed in most of the United States, and it created opportunities for people of mixed ancestry that existed nowhere else in America. Free people of color in New Orleans often achieved remarkable prosperity and cultural sophistication, forming a distinct class that owned property, operated businesses, and maintained their own schools and cultural institutions. The period following the Louisiana Purchase also saw significant changes in New Orleans architecture and urban planning. American settlers brought new building techniques and architectural styles, while the existing French and Spanish colonial traditions continued to evolve. The result was an increasingly eclectic mix of architectural influences that gave New Orleans its distinctive appearance. The famous shotgun houses that became synonymous with New Orleans neighborhoods emerged during this period, combining elements from Haitian, African, and American architectural traditions. Music continued to develop in fascinating ways during the early American period. The cultural mixing that had characterized New Orleans since its founding accelerated under American rule, as new musical influences arrived with settlers from other parts of the United States. Military bands introduced new instruments and musical arrangements, while the continued gatherings in Congo Square provided a space for the preservation and evolution of African musical traditions. The foundations were being laid for the musical innovations that would eventually give birth to jazz. The food culture of New Orleans also continued to evolve during this period, as American ingredients and cooking techniques mixed with existing French, Spanish, and African traditions. The abundance of seafood from the Gulf of Mexico, combined with rice, vegetables, and spices from around the world, created a cuisine that was becoming increasingly distinctive and sophisticated. Restaurants began to emerge in the city, catering to the growing population of merchants, travelers, and settlers who were drawn to New Orleans by its commercial opportunities. By the 1810s, New Orleans had established itself as one of America's most important cities, but it was also one of the most distinctive. The cultural synthesis that had begun under French colonial rule and continued through the Spanish period was reaching new levels of complexity under American governance. The city was becoming a place where multiple languages were spoken, different religious traditions coexisted, and cultural boundaries were fluid in ways that were unusual for early 19th century America. The stage was being set for New Orleans to emerge as a major cultural center, but the city would first have to survive one of the most dramatic military confrontations in American history. The War of 1812 was about to bring British forces to the gates of New Orleans, and the defense of the city would make Andrew Jackson a national hero, while demonstrating to the world that this unique, multicultural experiment was worth fighting for. The War of 1812 had been raging for more than 2 years when British forces set their sights on New Orleans in late 1814. For the British, capturing the Crescent City represented far more than a military victory. Control of New Orleans would effectively strangle American commerce throughout the Mississippi River Valley, potentially forcing the young republic to accept a humiliating peace treaty that would restore British dominance in North America. The stakes could not have been higher, and the fate of this remarkable multicultural experiment hung in the balance. The British assembled one of the most formidable invasion forces in their military history for the assault on New Orleans. More than 10,000 veteran soldiers, fresh from their victories over Napoleon in Europe, sailed across the Atlantic under the command of Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, the Duke of Wellington's own brother-in-law. These were battle-hardened troops who had fought in some of the bloodiest campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, and they were supremely confident in their ability to crush American resistance and seize the prize of New Orleans. But the British had underestimated both the strategic challenges of attacking New Orleans and the determination of its defenders. The city's unique geography, which had made it difficult to establish in the first place, now became a crucial defensive advantage. The maze of swamps, bayous, and waterways that surrounded New Orleans channeled any attacking force into predictable approaches, while the defenders could use their intimate knowledge of the terrain to mount an effective resistance. More importantly, the British failed to understand the unique character of New Orleans society and the fierce loyalty that the city's diverse population felt toward their adopted homeland. When news reached New Orleans that a British invasion was imminent, the city's residents rallied to its defense with an enthusiasm that surprised even American officials. French Creoles, Spanish colonists, free people of color, and recent American settlers put aside their cultural differences and united against the common threat. The man chosen to defend New Orleans was Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee lawyer and planter who had built his reputation fighting Creek Indians on the frontier. Jackson was a complex figure, known for his fierce temper, his unwavering determination, and his ability to inspire fierce loyalty among his followers. He was also a slaveholder who held deeply racist views about African Americans and Native Americans, yet he would prove willing to work with anyone who could help defend New Orleans, regardless of their race or background. Jackson arrived in New Orleans in early December 1814 to find a city in chaos. The regular American military forces in the area were woefully inadequate to repel a major British invasion, and there was considerable doubt about whether the local population could be relied upon to fight. Many of the city's French Creole elite had little love for the American government, while the large population of free people of color occupied an ambiguous position in American society that made their loyalty uncertain. But Jackson quickly demonstrated the pragmatic leadership that would make him a national hero. Recognizing that he needed every available fighter to defend the city, he reached out to groups that other American commanders might have ignored or rejected. He welcomed the support of Jean Lafitte and his band of pirates, who knew the local waterways better than anyone and possessed considerable military experience. He armed free men of color and organized them into military units, making them full partners in the city's defense despite the racial prejudices of the era. Jackson also reached out to the Choctaw Indians, whose knowledge of the local terrain and skill as warriors made them valuable allies. He even welcomed the assistance of recent immigrants and foreign nationals who had made New Orleans their home, recognizing that their stake in the city's future made them reliable defenders. This remarkable coalition of pirates, free men of color, Native Americans, Creole planters, and American settlers reflected the multicultural character of New Orleans itself. The British invasion began in earnest on December 23, 1814, when advance forces landed at Lake Bourne, east of the city. Jackson responded immediately with a night attack that caught the British off guard and demonstrated that the Americans would not wait passively for the enemy to organize their assault. The engagement was brief but fierce, and it served notice that the defense of New Orleans would be far more difficult than the British had anticipated. Over the following days, both sides prepared for the decisive battle that everyone knew was coming. Jackson established his main defensive line along the Rodriguez Canal, a dried-up waterway that ran from the Mississippi River to an impenetrable cypress swamp. This position, about 5 miles downstream from New Orleans, offered excellent defensive advantages and forced the British to attack across open ground with little cover. The American defensive preparations were remarkable for their ingenuity and the cooperation they demonstrated among diverse groups. Free men of colour worked alongside white soldiers to build earthworks and artillery emplacements. Pirates provided cannons and gunpowder from their hidden stockpiles. Creole planters contributed slaves to dig trenches and construct fortifications. Recent immigrants used their specialised skills as blacksmiths, carpenters, and engineers to strengthen the American position. The diversity of the American forces was unlike anything seen in previous military campaigns. Jackson's army included regular U.S. Army troops, Tennessee and Kentucky militia, Louisiana militia units that included both white Creoles and free men of colour, Choctaw warriors, and Lafitte's pirates. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and came from vastly different backgrounds, but they were united in their determination to defend their adopted home. The British, meanwhile, struggled with the unfamiliar terrain and climate of the Louisiana wetlands. Their European military experience had not prepared them for the challenges of manoeuvring large forces through swampy ground, and they found it difficult to bring their superior numbers to bear effectively. The December weather was unusually cold for New Orleans, and many British soldiers suffered from exposure and illness as they waited in soggy camps for the order to attack. On January 8, 1815, General Pakenham launched the main British assault on Jackson's defensive line. The attack was a disaster from the beginning. The British soldiers, advancing in traditional European formation across open ground, presented perfect targets for the American artillery and riflemen hidden behind their earthworks. The defenders included some of the best marksmen in America, frontiersmen from Tennessee and Kentucky who could pick off individual targets at remarkable distances. The slaughter was horrific and one-sided. In less than 30 minutes of fighting, the British suffered more than 2,000 casualties, including General Pakenham himself, who was killed while trying to rally his troops. The Americans lost fewer than 20 men in the engagement. The battle was so decisive that the surviving British forces withdrew immediately, ending the invasion attempt and securing New Orleans for the United States. The Battle of New Orleans had profound implications that extended far beyond its immediate military significance. For the first time in the city's history, its diverse population had united successfully in defense of a common cause. The victory demonstrated that the multicultural society of New Orleans could work effectively when faced with external threats, and it helped legitimize American rule over the former French and Spanish colony. The battle also catapulted Andrew Jackson to national fame and eventually to the presidency. But equally important was what the victory meant for the various groups that had participated in the defense. Free men of color who had fought bravely alongside white soldiers gained new respect and recognition for their contributions. Pirates like John Lafitte received presidential pardons for their past crimes. Native American allies were acknowledged as valuable partners rather than simply obstacles to American expansion. The victory celebration that followed the battle reflected the multicultural character of both the city and its defenders. French Creoles, Spanish colonists, Americans, free people of color, and even former pirates joined together in festivities that lasted for weeks. The cultural barriers that had seemed so important before the invasion appeared to dissolve in the euphoria of victory, creating a sense of shared identity that had not existed previously. But the Battle of New Orleans also occurred at a moment of profound irony that would become apparent only later. Unknown to the combatants, the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812, had been signed in Belgium 2 weeks before the battle took place. The slow pace of transatlantic communication meant that thousands of men had fought and died in a battle that was technically unnecessary. Yet in many ways, this accident of timing made the victory even more significant for New Orleans and its people. The peace that followed the War of 1812 ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity and growth for New Orleans. The city's strategic importance as the gateway to the American interior, was now unquestioned, and trade volumes increased dramatically as the nation expanded westward. Cotton exports through New Orleans grew exponentially as plantations spread throughout the Mississippi River Valley, making the city one of the wealthiest in America by the 1840s. The economic boom that followed the war also accelerated the cultural development of New Orleans in ways that would have lasting significance. The city attracted immigrants from around the world, each group adding new elements to the cultural mix that was becoming increasingly sophisticated and distinctive. Irish immigrants fleeing poverty in their homeland settled in large numbers, bringing their own musical traditions and working-class culture. German immigrants established businesses and contributed their skills as craftsmen and professionals. The period also saw significant immigration from the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, as political upheavals throughout the region sent refugees seeking safety and opportunity in New Orleans. These Caribbean immigrants brought with them cultural traditions that blended seamlessly with existing Afro-Creole practices, enriching the musical and culinary heritage of the city. The influence of Haitian immigrants was particularly significant in the development of New Orleans architecture, as they introduced building techniques and design elements that became integral to the city's distinctive appearance. The growth of New Orleans during this period was not just numerical, but also spatial. The city began to expand beyond its original colonial boundaries, spreading upriver and downriver along the natural levees of the Mississippi. New neighborhoods emerged with their own distinct characters, reflecting the diverse populations that settled in different areas. The American sector, upriver from Canal Street, became the center of English-speaking commercial activity, while the original French Quarter remained the heart of Creole society. This geographic expansion also reflected the increasing complexity of New Orleans' social structure. The rigid colonial hierarchies were giving way to a more fluid system based on wealth, education, and cultural sophistication, rather than simply ancestry or legal status. Successful merchants and professionals, regardless of their ethnic background, could achieve social prominence in ways that had been impossible under the colonial system. At the same time, the expansion of slavery as the cotton economy grew created new forms of oppression and exploitation that would cast a shadow over the city's prosperity. The cultural flowering of New Orleans during the antebellum period was remarkable by any standard. The city supported multiple newspapers in different languages, numerous theatres and opera houses, and a vibrant literary scene that attracted writers and intellectuals from around the world. The famous New Orleans opera season became a highlight of American cultural life, drawing performers and audiences from across the nation and Europe. The city's restaurants gained international reputations for their innovative cuisine, while its ballrooms and dance halls became legendary for their elegance and sophistication. Music continued to evolve in fascinating directions during this period, as the cultural mixing that had characterized New Orleans since its founding reached new levels of complexity. Military bands introduced new instruments and musical arrangements that influenced local musicians, while the continued gatherings in Congo Square provided a space for the preservation and development of African musical traditions. European classical music mixed with African rhythms, Caribbean melodies, and American folk songs to create hybrid forms that existed nowhere else in the world. The religious landscape of New Orleans also became increasingly diverse during the antebellum period. While Catholicism remained the dominant faith, Protestant denominations established churches to serve the growing English-speaking population. Jewish immigrants founded synagogues and contributed to the city's commercial life. At the same time, syncretic religious practices that blended African, Caribbean, and European traditions continued to develop, creating spiritual expressions that were unique to New Orleans. The prosperity of antebellum New Orleans was built on a foundation of human bondage that grew more extensive and more brutal as the cotton economy expanded. The city became one of the largest slave markets in North America, and the wealth that supported its cultural achievements was extracted from the unpaid labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. This fundamental contradiction between the city's celebration of diversity and freedom on one hand and its dependence on slavery on the other would eventually tear New Orleans and the nation apart. By the 1850s, New Orleans had become the fourth largest city in the United States and one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Its port handled more trade than New York in some years, and its cultural influence extended far beyond the American South. The unique synthesis of cultures that had begun with French colonization had reached remarkable sophistication, creating a society unlike anything else in America, or perhaps the world. Yet beneath the surface, prosperity and cultural achievement, tensions were building that would soon explode into civil war. The institution of slavery that had helped create New Orleans' wealth was under increasing attack from abolitionists in the North, while the city's complex racial hierarchy was becoming harder to maintain as national debates about slavery and freedom intensified. The multicultural experiment that had made New Orleans so distinctive was about to face its greatest test as the nation moved inexorably toward a conflict that would determine whether a society founded on human bondage could continue to exist. The stage was being set for the most traumatic period in New Orleans history, when the Civil War would bring Union occupation, economic collapse, and social revolution to the Crescent City. But it was also during this period of upheaval and transformation that the musical innovations brewing in New Orleans for more than a century would finally coalesce into something entirely new, something that would change not just American culture, but music around the world. The birth of jazz was just around the corner, waiting to emerge from the cultural crucible that was New Orleans. The Civil War arrived in New Orleans not with the thunder of cannons, but with the silent approach of Union naval vessels in the spring of 1862. Unlike many other southern cities that would endure lengthy sieges and devastating battles, New Orleans fell to federal forces with relatively little bloodshed. The city's strategic importance was so great that Union commanders prioritized its capture intact, and the complex geography that had protected New Orleans from the British in 1815 proved less effective against a naval assault up the Mississippi River. Admiral David Farragut's fleet had fought its way past the Confederate forts guarding the river approaches to the city, and by April 25, 1862, Union warships were anchored at the foot of Canal Street. The speed of the Federal advance caught many New Orleans residents off guard. Confederate forces had evacuated the city rather than risk its destruction in a hopeless defense, leaving behind a population uncertain about what Union occupation would bring. The immediate aftermath of the Federal takeover revealed the deep divisions that had always existed beneath New Orleans' cosmopolitan surface. While some residents, particularly free people of color and recent immigrants with little attachment to the Confederacy, welcomed the Union forces as liberators, others viewed the occupation as a humiliating defeat. Many wealthy white Creoles and Americans who had prospered under the slave-based economy felt their entire world was crashing down around them. General Benjamin Butler, the Union military governor appointed to administer occupied New Orleans, quickly became one of the most controversial figures in the city's history. Butler, a Massachusetts politician turned soldier, implemented harsh policies designed to crush Confederate resistance and transform New Orleans society. His notorious Woman Order, which declared that any woman who insulted Union soldiers would be treated as a prostitute, outraged the city's elite and earned him the nickname Beast Butler throughout the South. But Butler's policies also brought revolutionary changes that would reshape New Orleans society permanently. He began enrolling free men of color in Union military units, recognizing their potential value as soldiers and their intimate knowledge of local conditions. More dramatically, he started accepting enslaved people who fled to Union lines, effectively beginning the process of emancipation in Louisiana years before the formal end of slavery. The transformation of New Orleans during the Civil War was profound and multifaceted. The cotton trade that had made the city wealthy virtually disappeared as Union forces controlled the Mississippi River, and Confederate cotton could no longer reach international markets. Many of the grand mansions and elegant townhouses that had symbolized antebellum prosperity stood empty as their owners fled to Confederate territory or saw their fortunes evaporate. Yet the war also created new opportunities for groups that had been marginalized under the old system. Free people of color, who had always occupied an ambiguous position in New Orleans society, found themselves courted by Union officials who needed their support and expertise. Many became soldiers, spies, and administrators in the Union occupation government. Their knowledge of local customs, languages, and geography made them invaluable to federal forces trying to govern a hostile population. The enslaved population of New Orleans experienced the war as a gradual but irreversible march toward freedom. As Union control solidified, increasing numbers of enslaved people simply walked away from their masters, seeking refuge behind federal lines. The famous slave markets that had operated near the French Quarter for decades closed permanently, never to reopen. The entire economic and social system built on human bondage began to crumble, creating both opportunities and uncertainties for everyone involved. Music during the war years reflected the dramatic changes occurring throughout New Orleans society. Military bands from both Union and Confederate forces introduced new songs and musical styles, while the disruption of normal social patterns created space for musical experimentation. The gatherings in Congo Square continued, but they took on new meanings as enslaved people contemplated freedom and free people of color navigated their changing status in a society in upheaval. The religious landscape of New Orleans also shifted during the war years. Some Catholic churches found themselves caught between their traditional role, serving the white elite, and the new realities of Union occupation. Protestant denominations, often associated with Northern influences, gained new prominence as federal officials favored ministers who supported the Union cause. At the same time, the syncretic religious practices that had always flourished in New Orleans continued to evolve, incorporating new elements that reflected the changing times. The end of the Civil War in 1865 brought formal emancipation to Louisiana, but it also ushered in one of the most complex and contentious periods in New Orleans history. Reconstruction would bring dramatic political changes as formerly enslaved people gained the right to vote and hold office for the first time. The city's unique three-tier racial system, which had distinguished it from the rest of the South, came under pressure from both federal policies that recognized only black and white racial categories and from the resistance of white residents determined to maintain their privileged position. The political transformation of New Orleans during Reconstruction was remarkable. The city elected its first black mayor, and African Americans served in the state legislature, city council, and other government positions. The University of New Orleans was integrated, and public schools were open to children of all races for the first time in the city's history. These changes represented a revolutionary departure from the antebellum social order and created possibilities that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. But the progress of Reconstruction also generated fierce resistance from white residents who were determined to restore their former dominance. Secret organizations like the White League used violence and intimidation to suppress black political participation, while legal restrictions and economic pressure were employed to limit the practical effects of emancipation. The tension between the promise of equality and the reality of continued oppression would define New Orleans politics for decades to come. The economic recovery of New Orleans after the Civil War was slow and uneven. The cotton trade eventually resumed, but the city never regained its antebellum dominance in agricultural exports. New industries emerged, including sugar refining and coffee processing, while the ports continued to handle trade throughout the Mississippi River Valley. However, the destruction of the slave-based plantation system had permanently altered the economic foundations of the city's prosperity. During this period of social and economic upheaval, the musical traditions of New Orleans underwent their most dramatic transformation yet. The mixing of cultures that had characterized the city since its founding accelerated as former boundaries broke down, and new forms of expression emerged. Military band music, European classical traditions, African rhythms, Caribbean melodies, and American folk songs began to blend in ways that created something entirely unprecedented. The instruments left behind by departing military bands became available to local musicians, many of whom had little formal training but possessed remarkable creativity and skill. Cornets, trombones, clarinets, and drums found their way into the hands of young African-American musicians who began experimenting with new ways of playing familiar melodies. They took the rigid structures of military marches and infused them with the syncopated rhythms and improvised variations that reflected their own cultural heritage. The social clubs and mutual aid societies that proliferated in New Orleans during Reconstruction provided crucial venues for this musical experimentation. These organizations, which served both social and economic functions in the African American community, often hired musicians for their parades, dances, and celebrations. The competitive atmosphere among different clubs encouraged musical innovation, as each organization sought to outdo the others with more elaborate and exciting performances. The famous second line parades that became synonymous with New Orleans culture emerged during this period. These processions, which followed the official parade participants with their own improvised dancing and music making, created a participatory form of entertainment that reflected the democratic spirit of the era. Anyone could join a second line, regardless of their social status or musical training, and the energy and spontaneity of these events captured something essential about the New Orleans spirit. The neighborhood known as Storyville, established in the 1890s as New Orleans' legal red light district, became another crucial venue for musical development. The brothels, saloons, and dance halls of Storyville provided steady employment for musicians and created an environment where musical experimentation was not only tolerated but encouraged. The relaxed social atmosphere of the district allowed for interactions between musicians from different backgrounds that might not have occurred elsewhere in the segregated city. But it would be a mistake to assume that jazz emerged only from Storyville or only from the African American community. The musical synthesis that was occurring in New Orleans during the late 19th century involved musicians from all of the city's diverse communities. Creole musicians, many of whom had received formal European training, began incorporating African American musical elements into their performances. White musicians were influenced by the innovative sounds they heard around them, while immigrants from various countries added their own musical traditions to the mix. The legendary Buddy Bolden, often considered the first true jazz musician, exemplified this cultural mixing. Bolden, who played cornet in New Orleans in the 1890s and early 1900s, was known for his powerful, blues-influenced style that could be heard for miles across the city. He drew on ragtime, blues, spirituals, marches, and dance music to create a sound that was unlike anything that had been heard before. Although no recordings of Bolden survive, contemporary accounts describe his music as electrifying and revolutionary. Other pioneering musicians of this era included Jelly Roll Morton, who claimed to have invented jazz in 1902, and King Oliver, whose Creole jazz band would later feature a young Louis Armstrong. These musicians and many others were developing new techniques of improvisation, syncopation, and ensemble playing that would define jazz as a distinct musical genre. They were taking the cultural materials that had been accumulating in New Orleans for more than 2 centuries and forging them into something entirely new. The social context in which jazz emerged was crucial to its character. The music reflected the democratic ideals of Reconstruction, with its emphasis on individual expression within collective performance. Jazz ensembles operated more like musical democracies than orchestras, with each musician contributing their own voice to the overall sound. The improvised nature of jazz performance meant that no 2 renditions of a song were ever exactly alike, reflecting the fluid and dynamic character of New Orleans society itself. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 brought new challenges to New Orleans, as federal troops were withdrawn and white supremacist governments regained control throughout the South. The brief period of racial equality came to an end as Jim Crow laws were implemented to enforce segregation and disenfranchise African American voters. The promise of multiracial democracy that had seemed within reach during Reconstruction was replaced by a system of legal segregation that would persist for nearly a century. Yet the musical innovations that had emerged during this period of social upheaval could not be suppressed by political changes. Jazz continued to develop and spread throughout New Orleans and beyond, carrying with it the cultural DNA of the city's unique history. The music embodied the resilience and creativity of a people who had survived slavery, war, and oppression while maintaining their humanity and their capacity for joy. By the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans had produced a musical art form that would eventually conquer the world. Jazz represented the culmination of more than 2 centuries of cultural mixing, a sound that could only have emerged from the specific historical circumstances that had shaped the Crescent City. The music was simultaneously deeply rooted in local traditions and universally accessible, speaking to something fundamental about the human experience of struggle, survival, and celebration. The musicians who created jazz were drawing on the full spectrum of New Orleans' cultural heritage: African polyrhythms, European harmonic structures, Caribbean syncopation, Native American musical elements, and American folk traditions all contributed to the synthesis. The result was a music that transcended racial and cultural boundaries while remaining distinctly American in its democratic spirit and improvisational freedom. As news of this revolutionary music began to spread beyond New Orleans, musicians from other cities started making pilgrimages to the Crescent City to learn from the masters of this new art form. The Great Migration would eventually carry jazz to Chicago, New York, and other urban centers, where it would continue to evolve and influence popular culture worldwide. But the roots of jazz would always remain in New Orleans, in the cultural soil that had been enriched by centuries of mixing, conflict, and creativity. The birth of jazz represented more than just a musical innovation. It was the artistic expression of a society that had learned to find beauty in complexity, harmony in diversity, and hope in the face of adversity. The music captured the essence of New Orleans itself, a place where different cultures had collided and merged to create something unprecedented and wonderful. Jazz was the sound of America's most multicultural city finally finding its voice, and that voice would echo around the world for generations to come. The world for generations to come. The early decades of the 20th century marked a pivotal transformation for New Orleans as the music born in its streets began to capture the imagination of the wider world. The sounds that had been percolating in the city's neighborhoods, dance halls, and social clubs were about to embark on a journey that would reshape popular culture across America and beyond. Yet this musical exodus would also mark the beginning of a complex relationship between New Orleans and its greatest cultural exports. The economic opportunities that drew jazz musicians away from New Orleans were largely a result of the Great Migration, the massive movement of African Americans from the rural South to northern industrial cities that began around 1910. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York offered better wages, greater personal freedom, and escape from the increasingly oppressive Jim Crow laws that had strangled the promise of Reconstruction. For musicians, these northern cities also provided larger audiences, better venues, and the possibility of making recordings that could spread their music to a national audience. King Oliver's migration to Chicago in 1918 exemplified this pattern. Oliver had been one of New Orleans' most respected cornet players, leading his own band and mentoring younger musicians. But the opportunities in Chicago proved irresistible, and he established his Creole jazz band at the Lincoln Gardens, where it became the talk of the city's South Side. When Oliver sent for his young protégé, Louis Armstrong, to join him in 1922, it marked a symbolic passing of the torch from New Orleans to Chicago as the center of jazz innovation. Armstrong's arrival in Chicago represented one of the most significant moments in jazz history. The young trumpet player brought with him not just extraordinary musical talent, but also the full cultural heritage of New Orleans jazz. His powerful tone, innovative improvisational style, and charismatic stage presence would transform him into the first true superstar of jazz and help establish the music as a legitimate art form worthy of serious attention. But Armstrong's success also highlighted the complex relationship between jazz and race in America. While his music was celebrated by audiences of all backgrounds, he performed in a society where segregation and discrimination remained pervasive. The same cultural mixing that had given birth to jazz in New Orleans was viewed with suspicion and hostility in many parts of the country, and jazz musicians often found themselves caught between their artistic achievements and the social limitations imposed by racial prejudice. The spread of jazz beyond New Orleans was facilitated by several technological and social developments that transformed American culture in the early 20th century. The phonograph industry, which had emerged in the 1890s, began recording jazz performances, allowing the music to reach audiences far beyond the cities where it was performed live. The original Dixieland Jazz Band, a white group from New Orleans, made the first jazz recordings in 1917, though their music was a simplified version of the complex sounds being created by African-American musicians. Radio broadcasting, which began in earnest in the 1920s, provided another crucial avenue for spreading jazz music. Live broadcasts from nightclubs and dance halls brought the sounds of jazz into homes across America, creating a national audience for the music and its performers. The immediacy and intimacy of radio perfectly suited jazz's improvisational character, allowing listeners to experience the spontaneity and excitement of live performance from hundreds of miles away. The 1920s, often called the Jazz Age, saw the music achieve unprecedented popularity and cultural influence. Jazz became the soundtrack of the Roaring Twenties, providing the rhythmic backdrop for the social changes that were transforming American society. The music's emphasis on individual expression and creative freedom resonated with a generation that was rejecting Victorian social conventions and embracing new forms of personal and artistic liberation. Yet even as jazz conquered America, New Orleans continued to nurture new generations of innovative musicians. The city's unique cultural environment remained fertile ground for musical experimentation, and the departure of established stars created opportunities for younger players to develop their own styles and approaches. Musicians like Sidney Bechet, Jelly Roll Morton, and the members of the Preservation Hall Jazz Band maintained New Orleans' reputation as the cradle of jazz while adapting the music to changing times and tastes. The relationship between New Orleans and its musical offspring became increasingly complex as jazz evolved and spread. The music that had emerged from the city's specific historical and cultural circumstances began to develop in different directions as it encountered new environments and influences. Chicago jazz incorporated elements of blues and swing, while New York jazz became more sophisticated and harmonically complex. These regional variations enriched the overall development of jazz, but also meant that the music was moving further away from its New Orleans roots. The economic impact of jazz's success was significant but unevenly distributed. While individual musicians like Armstrong achieved fame and fortune, the communities that had nurtured jazz received relatively little direct benefit from the music's commercial success. The recording industry, radio networks, and entertainment venues that profited from jazz were typically owned and controlled by white businessmen, while many of the African American musicians who had created the music remained economically marginalized. This pattern reflected broader inequalities in American society, but it was particularly painful in New Orleans, where the cultural contributions of African American and Creole musicians were so clearly evident. The city that had given birth to America's most influential musical art form often struggled to maintain its own musical institutions and preserve its cultural heritage. Many of the venues where jazz had first flourished closed or changed character as economic and social conditions shifted. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought new challenges to New Orleans and its musical community. The economic collapse affected everyone, but it was particularly devastating for musicians and other entertainers who depended on discretionary spending for their livelihoods. Many jazz venues closed, and musicians found it increasingly difficult to make a living from their art. Some left the city in search of better opportunities, while others were forced to take non-musical jobs to support their families. Yet the Depression also sparked new forms of cultural expression and social organization in New Orleans. The federal government's Works Progress Administration funded various cultural projects, including music education programs and the documentation of folk traditions. These initiatives helped preserve important aspects of New Orleans' musical heritage while providing employment for local musicians and cultural workers. The Second World War brought dramatic changes to New Orleans as military installations expanded and defense industries developed throughout the region. The city's strategic location made it crucial to the war effort, and thousands of service members passed through New Orleans on their way to and from overseas assignments. This massive influx of people from all over America created new audiences for local music and helped spread awareness of New Orleans' cultural treasures. The war years also accelerated social changes that had been building for decades. The military's need for personnel led to some relaxation of racial barriers, and African American service members gained new experiences and expectations that would influence the civil rights movement in the post-war years. The cultural mixing that had always characterized New Orleans took on new dimensions as people from different regions and backgrounds encountered each other in unprecedented numbers. Jazz continued to evolve during the war years as musicians incorporated new influences and responded to changing social conditions. The big band era reached its peak, though this music was quite different from the small ensemble jazz that had originated in New Orleans. Bebop emerged as a more complex and intellectually challenging form of jazz, pioneered by musicians like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, who pushed the harmonic and rhythmic boundaries of the music in new directions. The post-war period brought both opportunities and challenges for New Orleans and its musical heritage. The economic boom that followed the war created new prosperity, but it also accelerated social and demographic changes that would reshape the city. Suburbanization drew many middle-class residents away from the neighborhoods where jazz had flourished, while urban renewal projects demolished some of the areas where the music had first developed. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought long overdue changes to the South, including New Orleans. The end of legal segregation opened new opportunities for African American musicians and cultural workers, while also forcing a reconsideration of the racial dynamics that had shaped jazz from its origins. The integration of schools, public facilities, and entertainment venues created new possibilities for cultural exchange, but also disrupted some of the separate institutions that had nurtured jazz in its early years. During this period, there was growing recognition of jazz as America's classical music, a serious art form deserving of academic study and institutional support. Universities began offering jazz programs, and scholarly attention to the music's history and development increased significantly. This academic validation was important for establishing jazz's cultural legitimacy, but it also raised questions about whether the music could maintain its vitality and authenticity within institutional settings. The tourism industry also began to recognize the economic value of New Orleans' musical heritage. The French Quarter became increasingly marketed as a destination for visitors seeking authentic jazz experiences, and numerous clubs and restaurants began featuring live music as a way to attract tourists. This commercialization provided employment opportunities for local musicians, but also raised concerns about the commodification of cultural traditions. The preservation movement that emerged during this period reflected growing awareness of the importance of maintaining New Orleans' unique cultural heritage. Organizations like Preservation Hall, founded in 1961, were established specifically to maintain traditional New Orleans jazz and provide venues for aging musicians who had been largely forgotten by the mainstream music industry. These efforts were crucial for documenting and preserving important musical traditions, though they also sometimes had the effect of treating jazz as a museum piece rather than a living, evolving art form. The festival movement that began in the 1970s created new opportunities for celebrating and sharing New Orleans music with wider audiences. The New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, first held in 1970, became one of the most important annual events in the city, showcasing not only traditional jazz but also the full range of musical traditions that had developed in the region. The festival's success demonstrated the enduring appeal of New Orleans music, while also providing economic benefits to local musicians and the broader community. The late 20th century saw renewed interest in the roots and traditions of New Orleans jazz, as musicians and scholars worked to document and preserve the knowledge of surviving early practitioners. The Smithsonian Institution and other cultural organizations sponsored extensive recording and interview projects designed to capture the memories and techniques of musicians who had lived through the early development of jazz. These efforts were particularly urgent as the generation that had direct connections to jazz's origins was rapidly aging. Contemporary New Orleans musicians faced the challenge of honoring their city's musical heritage while also developing their own artistic voices and responding to current musical trends. Some focused on maintaining traditional styles and repertoires, while others sought to incorporate elements of funk, rhythm and blues, hip-hop, and other contemporary genres into their work. This tension between tradition and innovation reflected broader questions about cultural authenticity and artistic development that had no easy answers. The hurricane that devastated New Orleans in 2005 brought unprecedented challenges to the city and its musical community. The massive flooding and destruction disrupted the networks of venues, institutions, and neighborhoods that had sustained local music for generations. Many musicians lost their homes, instruments, and livelihoods, while some of the city's most important cultural institutions suffered severe damage or were forced to close temporarily. Yet the recovery period also demonstrated the resilience and importance of New Orleans musical culture. Musicians organized benefit concerts and fundraising efforts to help their colleagues rebuild their lives and careers. The international attention focused on New Orleans during the recovery period brought new recognition of the city's cultural significance and generated support for preservation and rebuilding efforts. The experience reinforced the understanding that music was not just entertainment in New Orleans, but an essential part of the city's identity and survival. The early 21st century has seen New Orleans music continue to evolve and adapt while maintaining its connections to the city's rich cultural heritage. New generations of musicians have emerged who are simultaneously deeply rooted in local traditions and globally connected through digital technologies and international touring opportunities. The city's music scene remains remarkably diverse, encompassing everything from traditional brass band music to cutting-edge electronic experimentation. The challenge facing New Orleans today is how to maintain the cultural authenticity and community connections that have made its music so distinctive, while also adapting to the economic and social realities of the modern world. The gentrification and demographic changes that have affected many American cities pose particular threats to communities where cultural traditions have been passed down through families and neighborhoods for generations. The rising costs of living in the city center have forced many musicians and cultural workers to move to more affordable areas, potentially disrupting the geographic concentrations that have historically supported musical development. Educational institutions have played an increasingly important role in maintaining and transmitting New Orleans musical traditions. The New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, the University of New Orleans Jazz Program, and numerous community-based music education initiatives work to ensure that young people have opportunities to learn from master musicians and develop their own skills. These programs face ongoing challenges in terms of funding and institutional support, but they represent crucial investments in the city's cultural future. The digital age has created both opportunities and challenges for New Orleans musicians. Online platforms allow local artists to reach global audiences without leaving the city, while social media provides new ways to build fan bases and promote performances. At the same time, the decline of the traditional music industry has made it more difficult for musicians to earn sustainable livings from their art, and the proliferation of recorded music has changed the dynamics of live performance in complex ways. The relationship between New Orleans and jazz remains as complex and multifaceted as it was when the music first emerged from the city's unique cultural crucible more than a century ago. The music continues to serve as a powerful symbol of the city's creativity and resilience, while also raising ongoing questions about cultural ownership, artistic authenticity, and economic justice. The sounds that first emerged from the collision of cultures in colonial New Orleans have traveled around the world and back again, forever changed by their journey, but still carrying within them the DNA of their birthplace. As we look toward the future, the story of New Orleans and its music serves as a reminder of both the possibilities and the challenges inherent in cultural mixing and artistic innovation. The city's experience demonstrates how creativity can emerge from diversity and adversity, but also how difficult it can be to maintain cultural traditions in the face of economic pressures and social change. The ongoing vitality of New Orleans music suggests that the cultural forces that gave birth to jazz remain active and generative, continuing to produce new forms of expression that honor the past while speaking to contemporary realities. Today, New Orleans stands as a living testament to the power of cultural collision and creative synthesis. The city that began as a strategic French outpost has evolved into something far more complex and remarkable than its founders could have ever imagined. Walking through the streets of the modern Crescent City, you can still hear echoes of all the voices that have contributed to its unique character over more than 3 centuries. The French Quarter remains the symbolic heart of New Orleans, though the buildings that tourists admire today reflect layers of architectural history that span multiple colonial periods and cultural influences. The wrought iron balconies that have become iconic symbols of the city were actually Spanish innovations, while the basic street grid reflects French colonial planning adapted to the challenging geography of the Mississippi River Delta. The famous above-ground cemeteries continue to serve their practical purpose, while also standing as monuments to the city's unique relationship with death and memory. The neighborhoods that spread out from the original colonial core tell their own stories of cultural development and change. The Bywater and Marigny districts, once home to Creole planters and free people of color, have become centers of artistic innovation and bohemian culture. The Treme, one of America's oldest African-American neighborhoods, remains a crucial repository of musical and cultural traditions, even as it faces the pressures of gentrification and demographic change. Uptown New Orleans, with its grand mansions and tree-lined streets, reflects the wealth and aspirations of the American period while also incorporating architectural elements from earlier eras. The Garden District showcases the antebellum prosperity that cotton and sugar brought to the city, though the sources of that wealth are now understood in their full historical context, including the human cost of slavery and exploitation. The cultural institutions that have emerged in modern New Orleans reflect both continuity and change in the city's approach to preserving and celebrating its heritage. The New Orleans Museum of Art houses collections that span the full range of the city's cultural development, from colonial artifacts to contemporary works by local artists. The Historic New Orleans Collection serves as a repository for documents, images, and objects that tell the complex story of the city's evolution over time. Educational institutions play crucial roles in maintaining New Orleans' cultural traditions while also fostering innovation and adaptation. Tulane University and the University of New Orleans conduct research that helps illuminate the city's history and cultural development, while their music programs train new generations of performers and composers. Xavier University, a historically black institution, continues to serve as an important center of African-American higher education and cultural preservation. The public school system, despite facing numerous challenges, includes specialized programs designed to maintain connections to New Orleans' cultural heritage. The New Orleans Center for Creative Arts provides intensive training in music, theater, and visual arts, while various community-based organizations offer educational opportunities that might not be available through traditional academic channels. The festival culture that has become such an important part of New Orleans' identity reflects the city's ongoing commitment to celebration and cultural sharing. Beyond the famous Jazz and Heritage Festival, the city hosts dozens of smaller events throughout the year that showcase different aspects of its cultural diversity. The French Quarter Festival celebrates the historic heart of the city, while neighborhood festivals in areas like the Bywater and Treme highlight local traditions and community connections. Mardi Gras remains the most famous of New Orleans celebrations, though its contemporary form reflects centuries of evolution and adaptation. The elaborate parades and masked balls that characterize modern carnival trace their origins to both French colonial traditions and influences from other cultural groups that have made New Orleans home. The crews that organize Mardi Gras activities represent a unique form of social organization that combines exclusivity with public celebration, creating spectacles that unite the entire city while also reflecting its social hierarchies and divisions. The culinary traditions of New Orleans continue to evolve while maintaining their distinctive character and cultural significance. The restaurants that have gained international recognition for the city represent the culmination of centuries of cultural mixing and culinary innovation. Creole and Cajun cuisines, while often confused by outsiders, reflect different aspects of Louisiana's cultural heritage and continue to develop as new ingredients and techniques become available. The famous dishes that have become synonymous with New Orleans, from gumbo and jambalaya to beignets and po' boys, each tell their own stories of cultural adaptation and creativity. These foods represent more than just cuisine. They are expressions of the cultural synthesis that has made New Orleans unique. The techniques and ingredients that create these distinctive flavors were developed by cooks who drew on African, French, Spanish, Native American, and other traditions to create something entirely new. Contemporary New Orleans chefs continue this tradition of innovation, while also working to preserve and document traditional recipes and techniques. The city's culinary scene has gained national and international recognition, attracting food enthusiasts from around the world and creating new economic opportunities for local restaurants and food producers. This success has also raised questions about cultural appropriation and the commercialization of traditional foods, issues that reflect broader concerns about maintaining authenticity in an increasingly globalized world. The music scene in contemporary New Orleans remains as vibrant and diverse as ever, though it has also had to adapt to changing economic and social conditions. Traditional jazz continues to thrive in venues like Preservation Hall and at various festivals and celebrations throughout the city. At the same time, new forms of musical expression have emerged that incorporate elements of hip-hop, electronic music, and other contemporary genres while maintaining connections to the city's musical heritage. The brass band tradition that has been central to New Orleans music for more than a century continues to evolve, with groups like the Rebirth Brass Band and Trem Brass Band attracting both local and international audiences. These ensembles maintain the participatory spirit that has always characterized New Orleans music, while also incorporating contemporary influences and addressing current social and political issues through their performances. The second-line culture that grew out of the social aid and pleasure clubs of the 19th century remains an important part of New Orleans community life. These parades, which occur throughout the year in different neighborhoods, continue to provide opportunities for community celebration and cultural expression. The democratic nature of second lines, where anyone can participate regardless of their musical training or social status, reflects enduring values about inclusion and community that have characterized New Orleans culture from its earliest days. The challenges facing contemporary New Orleans are significant and multifaceted. The city continues to struggle with poverty, crime, and inadequate infrastructure, problems that affect all aspects of community life, including cultural preservation and artistic development. The education system faces ongoing difficulties that limit opportunities for young people, while the healthcare system remains inadequate for many residents. Environmental challenges pose particular threats to New Orleans and its cultural heritage. Climate change and sea level rise threaten the very existence of the city, while more frequent and severe hurricanes create recurring disruptions to community life and economic activity. The ongoing subsidence of the city, caused by both natural geological processes and human activities, requires constant vigilance and expensive engineering solutions. The demographic changes that have occurred in recent decades have also created new challenges and opportunities. The city's population has become more diverse in some ways, while also experiencing significant out-migration, particularly among African American residents. These changes affect the transmission of cultural traditions and the maintenance of community institutions that have historically supported New Orleans' distinctive culture. Gentrification pressures have intensified in many neighborhoods, particularly those close to the city center, that have traditionally been home to working-class families and cultural institutions. Rising property values and living costs have forced some long-time residents to move to more affordable areas, potentially disrupting the geographic concentrations of culture and community that have been crucial to New Orleans' cultural development. The tourism industry that has become so important to New Orleans' economy creates both opportunities and challenges for cultural preservation. While tourism provides employment and brings attention to the city's cultural treasures, it can also lead to the commodification of traditions and the creation of inauthentic experiences designed primarily for commercial purposes. balancing the economic benefits of tourism with the need to maintain cultural authenticity remains an ongoing challenge. Technology has created new possibilities for documenting, preserving, and sharing New Orleans culture with wider audiences. Digital archives allow for the preservation of recordings, photographs, and documents that might otherwise be lost, while online platforms provide new ways for local artists to reach global audiences. At the same time, the digital age has disrupted traditional forms of media and entertainment in ways that affect local musicians and cultural workers. The resilience that has characterized New Orleans throughout its history continues to be evident in the city's response to contemporary challenges. Community organizations work to address problems ranging from education and healthcare to environmental protection and cultural preservation. Neighborhood associations organize events and initiatives designed to strengthen local communities and maintain cultural traditions. The arts community in New Orleans remains remarkably active and innovative, with local artists working in various media to address contemporary issues while also drawing on the city's rich cultural heritage. Visual artists, writers, filmmakers, and performers continue to find inspiration in the unique environment and history of New Orleans, while also engaging with national and international artistic movements. The city's universities and cultural institutions conduct research and educational programs that contribute to understanding of New Orleans history and culture, while also addressing contemporary challenges. These efforts help ensure that the lessons and insights gained from the city's unique experience are preserved and shared with future generations. Looking toward the future, New Orleans faces both opportunities and uncertainties that will shape its continued development. The city's cultural heritage remains a valuable asset that attracts visitors, residents, and investment from around the world. The creativity and resilience that have characterized New Orleans throughout its history suggest that the city will continue to find ways to adapt and thrive despite the challenges it faces. The ongoing vitality of New Orleans culture demonstrates that the forces that gave birth to jazz and other distinctive art forms remain active and generative. New forms of cultural expression continue to emerge from the intersection of tradition and innovation, local identity and global connection, individual creativity and community collaboration. The collision of cultures that began more than 3 centuries ago continues to produce new synthesis and artistic achievement. The story of New Orleans reminds us that cultural creativity often emerges from a diversity, complexity, and even conflict. The city's experience suggests that the most profound and lasting forms of artistic expression may arise not from cultural purity or isolation, but from the dynamic interaction of different traditions, perspectives, and experiences. The music, food, architecture, and other cultural expressions that make New Orleans unique are the products of centuries of cultural mixing and creative adaptation. As we consider the lessons of New Orleans history, we can see that the city's greatest achievements have come not from any single cultural tradition, but from the synthesis of multiple influences. The French colonial origins provided important foundations, but Spanish rule brought crucial adaptations. American governance created new possibilities, and the contributions of African Americans, immigrants, and other groups have been essential to everything that makes New Orleans distinctive. The future of New Orleans will depend on the city's ability to maintain this spirit of cultural openness and creative synthesis, while also addressing the practical challenges of urban life in the 21st century. The preservation of cultural traditions must be balanced with the need for innovation and adaptation. The celebration of local identity must coexist with engagement with broader regional, national, and global communities. The remarkable story of how a small colonial outpost grew into one of America's most culturally significant cities offers insights that extend far beyond New Orleans itself. The city's experience demonstrates both the possibilities and the challenges inherent in cultural diversity, urban development, and artistic innovation. The sounds, flavors, and traditions that emerged from the unique historical circumstances of New Orleans continue to enrich not only American culture, but cultural expression around the world. In the end, the story of New Orleans is a testament to human creativity and resilience in the face of adversity. The city that has survived hurricanes, floods, epidemics, wars, and social upheaval continues to produce music, art, and culture that speaks to people everywhere. The collision of cultures that began centuries ago in the swamps of the Mississippi Delta has created something precious and enduring, a reminder that beauty and meaning can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when human beings come together with openness, creativity, and hope. Creativity and hope. The legacy of New Orleans extends far beyond its physical boundaries, reaching into every corner of American culture and beyond. The city that began as a strategic trading post has become something much more profound, a laboratory for human possibility, a place where the American experiment in democracy and cultural diversity has played out in its most complex and challenging forms. The music that emerged from its streets now resonates in concert halls and clubs from Tokyo to London, while its culinary innovations have influenced restaurants and home kitchens across the globe. The influence of New Orleans on American literature has been equally significant. Writers from Mark Twain to Tennessee Williams found inspiration in the city's unique atmosphere and complex social dynamics. The literary tradition that emerged from New Orleans reflects the same cultural mixing that produced jazz, blending different narrative traditions and linguistic influences to create distinctively American forms of expression. Contemporary authors continue this tradition, using the city's rich history and ongoing struggles as material for works that explore broader themes of identity, community, and survival. The architectural legacy of New Orleans has also had far-reaching influence on American building practices. The adaptations that colonial builders made to deal with the challenging climate and geography of the Mississippi Delta created design solutions that have been copied and modified in other parts of the South and beyond. The raised construction, wide galleries, and emphasis on natural ventilation that characterize New Orleans architecture have become standard features of building in hot, humid climates around the world. The social innovations that emerged from New Orleans' unique circumstances have also contributed to broader American culture. The city's complex racial hierarchy, while often oppressive, also created spaces for cultural mixing and social mobility that were rare in other parts of the country. The tradition of social aid and pleasure clubs provided models for community organisation that have been adopted by other urban communities facing similar challenges. From indigenous settlements to French colony, from Spanish rule to American statehood, from the birthplace of jazz to a modern cultural powerhouse, New Orleans has proven that when cultures collide, extraordinary things can happen. The city stands today as living proof that diversity isn't just about tolerance, but about the creative magic that emerges when different traditions blend, clash, and ultimately create something entirely new. The sounds of jazz that first echoed through Congo Square now fill concert halls worldwide, carrying with them the DNA of a city that dared to be different.